This episode of the Prestige TV podcast is brought to you by Coffee Mate.
Coffee Mate has been searching the globe for flavors that pair perfectly with coffee.
So when they heard that the new season of HBO's The White Lotus was set in Thailand, they were inspired to brew up 2 new flavors, Thai iced coffee and pina colada flavored creamers.
They're available for a short time only. So for the love of coffee, go try them now.
Look, it's not that confusing. I'm Rob Harvilla, host of the podcast 60 Songs That Explain the 90s, except we did 120 songs. And now we're back with the 2000s. I refuse to say aughts. 2000 to 2009. The Strokes, Rihanna, J-Lo, Kanye, sure. And now the show is called 60 Songs That Explain the 90s, the 2000s. Wow, that's too long a title for me to say anything else right now. Just trust me. That's 60 Songs That Explain the 90s, the 2000s. Preferably on Spotify.
I love you. I said.
Oh, no, I love you too, and I'm sorry.
Bye.
See ya.
Hello, welcome back to the Prestige TV podcast feed. I'm Joanna Robinson.
I'm Rob Mahoney.
And we're here to talk to you about a doozy of an episode of Severance. We have a lot to get to. Could do this for hours, literally, but we will try to do it in our usual allotted Prestige time. I will note, though,
if you say so, Joe. I don't know that that's going to happen today, but we're going to try.
We're going to do our best. You might note that the runtime is longer than usual on this episode. That's because we've got an interview with Damon Lindelof, who came into the studio this week to talk about his Severance thoughts and theories and all the rest. This is an edited version of a longer conversation, which is up on YouTube. So if you go to the Ringer TV YouTube channel, you can watch an hour of Damon Lindelof talking about Severance. And if you listen to this podcast, you get about half of that. You get like severed, essentially. So, that is what is going on this pod today. And
I'll say a lot of great theories, a lot of great Bardo discussion from
Yes.
Damon on this pod, and the exciting debut of Joanna Robinson, NBA podcaster, which is something that I hold near and dear to my heart. So thank you for joining our space.
with a script written for me by one Mr. Rob Mahoney.
It's a team effort. Look, the best podcasts are 2-handers or 3-handers, like we're all working together in this.
It's true. Okay, so listen, elsewhere on the Prestige feed, you and I are covering White Lotus midweek. Bill and Mallory and I are covering White Lotus immediately after the episode drops on Sunday. So you can watch all of that on the Ringer TV YouTube channel as well. We are keeping our eyes on the pit. It's a tough hang sometimes, but we are watching it, and we'll be checking back in with that. And then also, we get this question all the time. Just to reiterate, Mallory and I are covering Yellow Jackets over on House of R. So if you're looking for Yellow Jackets episodes of Prestige, they don't exist this year. They're over on House of R because we have a lot going on in this feed right now. And one last thing I want to say about the Damon interview, and I'll say it again later. Rob and I might reference it a little bit as we're talking about it, but it was recorded before either of us had seen episode 7. So there's perhaps a stale take or two in that interview that does not hold up post episode 7.
But some big picture theory from one of the masters of the craft of these sorts of puzzle box shows on how to do it and what you should be looking for, and kind of how these strands are pulled together, which, holy hell, Joe, a lot of strands being pulled together this week. A lot of things happening this week on Severance. Absolutely.
Before we get to that, can we do like a quick zoom through some emails we got? Where can folks find us, Rob?
They can always find us at prestigetv@spotify.com. But in particular, you can find us at pineapplebobbing@gmail.com. We got, dare I say, more emails than ever this week. They just keep coming. And you guys were really quick on the emails this week. So we got a lot of post-episode 7 emails. We record this the morning after the episode drops, and you guys were burning the midnight oil, watching the episode and emailing us thoughts about Russian literature, all kinds of stuff. So we will be getting to that. But in terms of stuff that applies to last week, I hear all of you.
You don't want me washing my chicken. I will continue to wash my chicken. Don't worry about it. Okay.
I thought we won you over. But look, I support you living your truest life, even if it is one that's riddled with bacteria.
I keep a really clean kitchen. Speaking of kitchens, a lot of people seem to think that third oven in Field's kitchen is a microwave drawer. Even we got a listener, Shane, who is a commercial interior designer, sent us some photographic evidence that is probably what that is. So does that make you more or less excited about the 3-door situation in the Field's kitchen?
A little less. I don't like a low microwave, like one that's built into an island or built into low cabinetry per se. But if it's, say, a miniature convection oven and not a microwave, then I'm back on board.
Okay. Speaking of the decor in the Field's kitchen, we got several people writing in about the salt and pepper grinders to let us know that, in fact, that collection is quite costly. They
uncultured swine that we are. We did not realize the design significance of these mid-century modern grinders.
Famed salt and pepper grinders for Dansk. And I should say, I actually own something by Dansk. Do you know what a butter warmer is?
I don't think I do.
Okay, so neither did I until I bought this. Basically, I lived in a place that did not have a microwave in an island or otherwise.
Okay.
And I had like a bone broth habit, and I wanted like a cup of hot bone broth in the morning, and it felt silly to use an entire pot. So I was looking for like a wee pot to put on the stove to warm up some bone broth. And a butter warmer is essentially like a small enamel pot with like a little wooden handle. Mine is like a red enamel with a little wooden handle, and it is the cutest fucking thing in the whole world. And even though I have a microwave now, I like refuse to part. I mean, I presume you warm butter to pour on popcorn. I don't know what you would do with a butter warmer otherwise. Just like if you want some melted butter and you don't want to put it in the microwave, and it's got a little like spout on it. So it's like a perfect little like, you could heat it up and then like it looks nice. You could pour it. Anyway, that's my butter warmer. Side
brought to you by Dansk
chat. You can find it on the Food 52 website. That was not a free ad. Okay. And then on a much more sort of dare I say serious, more serious than a butter warmer level, we got this great email from Zachariah about Mr. Milchick, which I think is really interesting to talk about in the context of this episode when we see him sort of barring the way for Gemma when she is on the verge of escaping the testing floor. And what I wrote in my notes when I saw that, I wrote, after watching Miss Milchick go through the performance review and the self-flagellation that was the paperclip exercise and the sort of self-beratement in the mirror, all that sort of stuff, I wrote down oppressed oppressor. Like what happens when instead of banding together against the person that is oppressing you, you sort of grab onto whatever little shreds of power you do have inside of the system.
Right.
But something that Zachariah wrote in sort of specifically about the language component of Mr. Milchick's review is he wrote, my read, someone like Mr. Milchick would have internalized the feeling that he would need to be better, twice as better, 3 times as better as the Kier white children to ever bask in his virtuous light. He honed his vocabulary to showcase his nimble wit and won't ever be put in a position where he's not polished enough, which is why he was knocked down a peg. This is the exact dynamic, I think, that informs this character. And I think the show is actually deeply about race and caste without hardly ever being explicit about it. This also applies to Dylan G and Natalie at various times. And then he goes on to talk about the term uppity, which is like a racially specific term used to sort of put people in their place. But it is a term we heard earlier this season. Drummond used it in reference to Devin. He was like, his sister is much more uppity than he is, talking about Mark. But it's in the water in terms of what's going on with Milchick and Lumen at this time. And in this larger conversation we've been having about like the severed as people who are considered not human.
Right.
And all of that. So I really enjoyed that email from Zachariah.
Well, especially, I mean, we already understand the broadest strokes of why Milchick reacts the way he does to being gifted the paintings of Kier, the racially adjusted paintings. But if you are someone who has gone to such incredible lengths to make yourself corporate friendly, all of this code switching he does, all of this like flourishing language that he incorporates, and then when you try to do that to be slapped on the hand for doing it, like it's understandable why he would feel as if the rug has been pulled out from him in that moment.
Yeah.
Because he's a guy who's doing all the right things in a corporate sense and checking all the boxes that they want him to check, and yet he
still
still
not good
ends
enough.
up in this place.
All right, this week's episode is Chikai Bardo. I am pronouncing it pretty close to how it's pronounced in the show, but if my Valley Girl Chikai sounds like a little off, you can let me know. Directed by a cinematographer, Jessica Lee Gagne. This is her directorial debut, but she is this sort of main DP for the last season and a half of Severance. And I feel like she really showed up and splashed out with the visual, like the flashback visuals and everything. We'll talk about some of the specifics there. And then written by Dan Erickson, series creator, and Mark Friedman. I want to start here, Rob. What do you, Rob, think happens in this episode? Because I think there is some, though not a lot, of potential wiggle room in terms of interpreting what we see. What's your interpretation?
I guess which part? Because there's a lot to dissect. And I think depending on how you take apart the various elements of this show, the texture of the decisions and the reveals can change pretty dramatically. So how big picture do you want to go here?
Okay, let's say, do you believe everything we see on the testing floor is actually what is happening on the testing floor?
Yes.
Me too. Do you think that everything we saw in flashback form was that Mark POV? Or was that Gemma POV, or was that some sort of combination of the two?
I think it is a combination of the two.
Okay. Do you think that sort of collective unconscious combination of the two approach to flashback does that sort of help us understand why Mark might be uniquely qualified to refine Gemma, if that is in fact exactly? We'll get into sort of the specifics of what we may think is happening with the refining process. But do you feel like that underlines that sort of connection, collective memory, collective emotional experience that they share?
Without a doubt.
Damon will explain it, as you mentioned, in a bit more detail. But how does all of this jive with your understanding of the concept of the Bardo?
I thought you were going to say my concept of death, which that was going to be a much bigger conversation, but it's also not that.
It's early, Rob. I'm not going to make you talk about what is your concept of death.
The Bardo is very interesting in the context of this episode. I think, in a manner of speaking, when we do get it referenced by name, Chikai Bardo, it is Gemma looking at these lumen ideographic cards.
Yeah.
And that's her interpretation of it. And as she's saying that, she's also describing the exercises she's doing as a sort of like, is this a duck or is this a rabbit perception test?
Right.
So the fact that she sees that card and sees a Bardo, sees a trial, sees a transition into a state of death, sees a manner of acceptance, I think that tells me more about anything else. Like she, based on where she is at that point in the story and everything that she is going through, she is interpreting that card specifically as that sort of transition into death.
She also mentions ego death.
Yep.
And do you want to talk about where we've seen that card before?
Boy, do I.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So you may remember this card as the one that Dylan G pocketed at work in season 1 when the MDR team was visiting O&D. And Milchick has to jar him awake off the clock to find out the location of that card. And if you don't remember what it looks like, it's roughly a guy doing like a Warrior 2 yoga pose, standing opposite another man, like hand to his chest, effectively. And yeah, Gemma has interpreted this as some kind of ego death, as a person fighting within themselves or combating themselves. Very interesting to revisit that episode in retrospect, the one in which Dylan takes that card. Milchick's response, not unlike in this episode, very panicked. High stakes for a guy who took a card out of a department who doesn't have any idea what it is. And his quote from that episode is, "Dylan, listen, you have no idea how sensitive this information is. If someone paid you to smuggle out that card, ... And then Dylan interrupts him. I think we're getting a sense of how important these kinds of cards might be.
And Gemma just got it in the mail, man.
Just got it in the mail.
All right. Basically, we're taking, so this idea of the Bardo, which is this liminal space between life and death. And again, once again, Damon Lindelof will do a great job of explaining in more detail what that is. But we could apply that to Mark, who's on the verge of collapse, throughout this episode. His after hitting the floor pretty hard last week, like there's a version of the story where he doesn't make it on the other side of this episode. And then also Gemma, who is post-death of a kind, living out her afterlife. And this idea of the Bardo as a space where you will meet all the people you ever knew in your life. Or versions of yourself, I guess, is sort of more applicable to what is going on here. I like to think of this as like a new circle of hell, the testing floor. We've been talking about Lumen or, the severed floor as an underworld, as a hell sort of space. And this is just like another trip to another circle in the Dante sense of hell. And our listener Katie wrote in, this is her recap of what she feels like is happening on the testing floor.
Okay.
She also recommends we watch the OA, especially if we are like fiending for more Jason Isaacs in our life. She says, is this Lumen's game to sell Severance to the masses to cut out plane rides? Did you have a moment where you're like, plane rides? We talked about that on this podcast.
We kind of talked about some of these things in a way that is disconcerting.
Like that we were joking about it and they're like, no, but seriously?
But guess what? Tough. What if you did it and then sold it to people? Wouldn't that be valuable?
To sell Severance to the masses to cut out plane rides, root canals, abusive family dynamics, sexual trauma is Lumen's future one where everyone has a chip in their head and brothels are legal again because who cares? The women won't remember what you do to them. No pain meds for surgeries or procedures because those are risky and expensive. Better to just do it while severed. So once again, a spooky new layer to our What Would You Sever game that we've been playing. And I mean, this is my interpretation. There's a couple options here. I think that seems to be the main one, or because we saw in season 1 a woman who sort of severed herself out of her labor experience, right? So that's an option. But also in terms of having a workforce that you sever and knowing that you can do the most horrendous extreme things to them and they will not remember it at all.
Or you won't be liable for any of those things.
Right.
I think there's all of these corporate benefits to abusing your employees to an inch of their life and then them not remembering it.
Tough. That's an understatement. Grim.
Quite grim, Joe.
Grim. And I think, we've seen it a couple times, like when Mark in season 1 gets an explanation for why he has like a bump on his head when he's an Audi, or most recently after the Orpo has an explanation for why he was all wet, sort of explained to him. But if the severance practice is sort of, if the walls are holding even firmer or even higher, sort of what more could they do that an Audi wouldn't even know that they did? So.
And that is one of the big questions raised by this episode. We see Gemma going through all of these very unique torture mechanisms effectively, right? Ways to create negative emotion in her.
Yeah.
We already know, as you just said, that Severance is strong enough to withstand the physical, emotional, psychic pain of childbirth. We know that it's effective on that level to the point that a new mom would have zero memory of the labor she just experienced. And so what are we doing here? Like the limits already seem quite high, but I would say the incredible distinction within this episode is we have gone so far beyond innies and outies at this point. Like Gemma is going into each of these rooms with a distinct consciousness.
Persona.
A distinct persona where the version of her that is going to the dentist just left the dentist. And the version of her that's going on the plane just left the plane. And they are just living in a loop of that exact thing over and over and over. And so Gemma's consciousness, unlike Mark or Dylan or Irving or anybody else, is fractured into who knows how many pieces.
Exactly. Like there are so many. We find out in one of her intake sessions with Dr. Mao, who we'll talk about in a second, but like that she did 6 rooms in one day.
Yes.
But there are so many rooms down there. Place names that we've never seen on an MDR monitor on these doors and stuff like that. Cold Harbor, though, still remains a secret, right?
Yeah.
She has not been in the Cold Harbor room. This is like a new room for her, and she saw the label on it, but she has not been inside it, right? That she knows
Has not
of.
been inside. What do you think is in there, Joe? What do you
don't
is it a room of puppies? What do you think is happening?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Rainbows, sunshine, lollipop, something like that.
Well, real talk on that front.
Mm.
I think it's not hard, given the structure of the show, to draw a line between what is happening in these rooms and, say, the four tempers that we've been
Sure.
put right before us so often in Severance. And if that is the case, we're getting all negative emotions in this episode. We're getting the Christmas card thank you writing. We're getting the plane turbulence. We're getting the 2-hour dental exam. We're not getting anything that looks a lot like Frolic. I'll say that. And so I'm not ruling out the possibility that whatever's happening in Cold Harbor could be a positive emotion.
How optimistic for you.
I'm not feeling good about it. I'm just saying this is a thing that is possible. But if the end game of this sort of severance is shielding out negative feelings, there would be no need to sever out positive feelings. So it's probably still absolute shit, whatever is happening in there. But the absence of Frolic is noted.
Well, we'll always have it tattooed on Drummond's hand if we need it.
Certainly will.
Okay, so we mentioned that Gemma has a number of not only personas, but also she has wigs and costume changes. And something that you texted to me, Rob. Rob is very assiduous about not talking about the episode. He does not burn pod. We don't pre-chat about the episode.
Only talk for money, Joe.
But what you did text me is you said, we're going to need to talk about Dollhouse.
We have to.
And also our listener, Mike, coincidentally wrote into us about Dollhouse just last week. So shout out, Mike. Deacon Lockman, who plays Gemma, aka Miss Casey, you and I both, I think, were introduced to her on the TV show Dollhouse, which ran from 2009 to 2010 for 2 seasons. Do you want to tell the people at home who maybe did not catch this quickly canceled gem what Dollhouse is about?
I would love to. Even Gem might be strong. I would say it's overall quite an uneven show.
Patchy.
Quite patchy Joss Whedon series that is about, not unlike Severance, the creation of a technology, except in this case, it's a technology in which you can program a person. And clients will hire the company that owns this technology to program these people, these dolls, into whatever they want them to be, whatever persona they want them to have. And so, Deacon Lockman spends that whole series going episode to episode in wildly different personas, doing wildly different things. Spoiler alert, many of the clients just want to have sex with these people with very specific kinks or very specific personalities or appearances. And so there's something, certainly in my brain, about watching Deacon Lockman put on wigs, put on outfits, put on heels, go to room after room after room and be subjected to torture that certainly feels a lot like Dollhouse to me.
The main doll on that show is Eliza Dushku of Buffy Vampire Slayer fame. And like you and I both agree that she's not the greatest part of that show. But Deacon Lockman and Enver Joke, who play 2 of the other dolls, are like phenomenal.
Uncanny at exactly this thing. Their ability to transmute into exactly what they need to be
different
for a weird
accents,
characterization.
Different whatever it is. And so that was like a pure pleasure of watching Dollhouse. I have been waiting for Deacon Lockman to have like another opportunity to really show what she can do. And she's popped up here and there, but I don't think she's been, and even in season 1 of Severance was not, she's great, but not given a lot to work with. And then this is just a Deacon Lockman showcase this episode, and she's phenomenal in it. And one other thing I want to say about Dollhouse is that ostensibly in that show, everyone who is a doll has volunteered, has signed up for 5 years of this in exchange for a good deal of money or to make something bad in their life go away or whatever it is. Except for our main character who, there are questions about whether she's there consensually. And, I would say a similar case for Gemma here, where my interpretation of what we see in this episode is that Lumen has been lurking in Gemma and Mark's life since they're very meet cute. They're at a blood drive run by Lumen. When they're having fertility issues, they go to a fertility clinic run by Lumen, where Dr. Maurer, who we spend a good deal of time with in this episode, is at that clinic. We see her have a miscarriage. We see that take a toll on their relationship. And it feels to me, by the way, the nature of her goodbye to him that night, that she has voluntarily signed herself up for this.
Yes.
But that she is being kept now like it feels like to me that Dr. Maurer is unlikely to let her go. He's lying to her about what's happening in the inside. Outside, she is asked to leave. She's being told she can't leave. So however she was directed into this path, there are some theories already out there that like Lumen might have caused her miscarriages in order to push her in this direction. Like it's certainly within the wheelhouse of the nefarious shit that they do. But whatever pushed her in here, there was a choice that was seemingly hers. But now she's trapped in a scenario that she doesn't have the ability to say, I would like to stop now.
That would be my read on it. I think it's fair, if not entirely founded by the subtext of the show, to think that maybe she was straight up taken, right? That she did go not to execute a charade, but to go play charades. Like she was honestly going to her friend's house, and based on Maurer's appearance earlier, as you said, at the fertility clinic, like there was a scouting, like recruitment effort happening, the mailers, like there's something happening here that is, I'm sure, subconscious, right? That is them trying to influence her in some ways to do what it is they want. We don't exactly know yet, other than to be here and be a guinea pig. And so this is the sort of big like A or B to me about this episode is was Gemma taken by Lumen, or did she choose to leave and got more than she bargained for? I think it's much more likely to be that outcome.
I think it's the latter, mostly because, again, of that rewatching that scene where she says goodbye to Mark.
Yes.
And she's like, I could stay. And he's like, no, go. It just seems very much like she knows she's leaving for something, though I don't believe this episode gives no indication that she thought it meant forever or even for years,
I would say a couple of data points on that front. We do hear in some of the dialogue between Drummond and Maurer that Gemma has tried to break Maurer's fingers before. Like she has tried to escape her captivity before.
That's right.
She did not sign up to be a guinea pig indefinitely.
Right.
Also, I don't know if we want to get into Russian literature corner this early.
Oh, I do.
But we simply must. And if we're going to talk about the death of Ivan Ilyich, a story about how maybe being dead isn't always just being dead, but living in a way that is untrue to yourself and unfulfilling in a way that makes you dead before you actually die. It's name checked several times in this episode, specifically with Gemma, who is teaching Russian literature. And I don't know how to read that final exchange with Mark and the slow deterioration of their relationship other than a woman who is dying, even if she is not actually dead.
We've cited Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind several times, but I was so reminded of it in this flashback sequence, watching them go from like the giddiness of, the meet cute and first love and the idyllic early days of their relationship and their marriage into, it's with the added harrowing infertility story that is part of their story. But you think about Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, and you think about them getting to the point in the relationship where they're like at a Chinese restaurant and they can't even talk, we are the dining dead, like they can't even talk to each other.
Yes.
And so there are ways in which Gemma is, again, infertility is a very touchy subject, so I don't want to like make presumptions for anyone, but inside of this character, inside of this episode, I would say there's certainly something going on there. Like Haley, our listener Haley wrote in for Tolstoy Corner. And she said, she sort of summed it up this way. She said, Tolstoy decided that death, if you lived a true authentic life, isn't something to be feared. But if you do fear it, it's because you lived artificially or focused on the wrong things. And that can lead us to try to hide from ourselves and death and shut down. And Ivan at the end of the story, quote, dies, but because he learned that death isn't something to be feared, he doesn't die at all. Lots of the fear of death and hiding from it can be traced into Mark, and lots of the artificial, authentic stuff can be traced into Helly and Helena. But what I thought was interesting was the idea that death, the ending of oneself, only happens when authenticity is lost completely. So, like, when we think about Gemma, is Gemma alive? She's alive is like the big line at the end of season 1.
And Ragabi gets one in this episode. We're at our like 4th different she is alive variation at this point.
And like certainly in the spirit of her breaking fingers and trying to escape and saying Mark's name a few times, there are ways in which Gemma is still alive. But there are also indications that like when she's getting her sort of vitals read by this nurse played by the great Sandra Bernhardt. Great casting. And we'll talk about Robby Benson as Dr. Bauer in a second. But like when she's getting her vitals read, one of the questions she asks is like, did you do your reading today? And she's like, yeah, 50 pages. But I was just like, and 50 pages isn't nothing. But for an academic, I think of all the like, in terms of showing us their life in the span of just a few minutes of an episode of television, the really clever effect of the stacking up the books and the papers and stacking down, which is a huge part of that montage. These are two academics who fall in love talking about their respective fields. And you really get the sense of what is lost with these brains when they're neutered and severed into docile complicity. And so like the compliance is what I meant, not complicity. So Gemma saying, yeah, I read 50 pages. Like, yes, but like, is she?
That's light work for someone like her.
How much is she still Gemma at this point? You know, I don't know.
It's hard to say. I think one of the interesting images to reference on that is the thank you cards, which by the time we see her writing one is so illegible.
Yes.
Like does not look like understandable writing in any sense. And is that granted because she has now written hundreds of thank you cards and her hand is cramped beyond like any kind of recognition in the thing she is writing? Or is there something going on with Gemma more existentially, more spiritually? Is there something going on with the sub-severed brain that she's now working with?
Yeah.
Where she is losing some of her fine motor skills. Yeah. Where she's losing control of some of even the verbal elements that as an academic would come so easily to her.
One of our listeners, Todd, pointed out, and I missed this, that Gemma is a lefty, and that Todd was like, there's a particular form of torture of making a lefty write with a fountain pen.
It's very
because
true.
The smear factor is just off the charts. And so she's writing and he's like, the nib is all like upside down and backwards. And yeah, the writing like looks nearly gibberish, which you're right, might be a reflection of declining mind, or it might be a reflection of making her write as many thank you letters as she wrote. I thought that was like sort of it's always fucking Christmas, but I thought it was like a really diabolical alongside the dentistry, writing endless thank you notes sounds like absolute torture to me.
But overall, I think as far as the how alive is Gemma question.
Yeah.
Taking the Tolstoy elements and taking the Chakai Bardo specifically, really the idea of a Bardo, right? This not just transition stage, but one that involves the acceptance of death. I see that as like a pretty clear indication of where Gemma is throughout this episode. And we cover a lot of time. We cover the nature of her entire relationship with Mark, basically front to back. I'm sure there's plenty of things missing, and we may get those gaps filled in over the course of future episodes. But this is someone who is coming to terms, or has already come to terms in a way, with the death of, if not who she is, then certainly her relationship, and certainly the person she was with Mark.
And I think what's interesting to me is I agree with all of that. I think all of that is true. And yet she is more alive than we've seen her so far.
Yeah.
We believe this is actually physically Gemma. I am sort of out on Miss Casey as a clone theory. Like this is physically her body.
Also, this is a little extra textural. So if you don't like kind of cast interviews, maybe skip ahead a little bit. Basically, everyone making this show has been incredibly emphatic to the point of insulting that this is not a clone situation. Yeah. So maybe that's them all covering up for the thing that they know to be true. But at this point, I think it's much less likely.
I agree. Though I really did like Damon's clone theory. And if you want to hear it, I cut it out of the episode just because of that. Like, but you can see it on the YouTube interview. It's pretty solid, except maybe not actually true. But anyway, she's more alive than we've seen her thus far. And so, you know, and this is something I had talked to Damon on the full interview that you can watch, like previous to watching this episode. So mere days ago, I was like, I think it matters that Miss Casey, like that Gemma's dead and she should stay dead and et cetera, et cetera. And now I'm in conflict. And now our love quadrangle polygon has gotten so complicated because at the end of this episode, you're like, Mark and Gemma have to be united. Like he wakes up with tears in his eyes thinking about her. She's like feebly saying his name, you know, in tears on her way back down to the testing floor. Like, of course they have to be put back together. Except we still care so much about Helly.
Yeah.
Like, it's this is exactly where they want us, which is deeply conflicted about what the outcome we're most rooting for is. So
deeply conflicted about those outcomes, and also deeply conflicted about, as we're going through, what is happening in the mechanics of this show. And
right.
I would argue that Gemma is dead in a lot of senses, that she is not the person that she was, that she is going through a kind of spiritual and existential transition, if not a physical death in the way that Mark understands it. And Severance is so good at having it both ways. It's so good at making us ask a lot of these questions. And we kind of jumped straight into the mysteries of this week's episode and the substantial answers of this week's episode. I don't want to zoom past the fact that not only is this the best episode of Severance, Joe,
Yes.
I think it is the best episode of any show that you and I have covered together. I just think this is masterful, astonishing, staggering work.
I really agree.
Like Hall of Fame stuff in its own category, but
it's definitely
shows,
top 5. It's definitely top 5. I'm not sure I'm willing to unsee Crimson Sky yet, but because we did cover Shogun together, but it is definitely top 5 episode of television we've ever covered, and probably top 3 at least. Yeah.
I think it's perfect in the way that is this is the kind of story that can only be told with soft sci-fi, right? There are these incredibly human elements in there. There are these wonderful sci-fi constructions, including, maybe most heartbreakingly, the fact that Gemma does stage this huge escape, finally gets her jailbreak moment, and turns into Miss Casey as soon as she gets out of the elevator, which is just an incredibly gutting turn of events, and then is returned to the floor without ever even seeing what's on the other side or knowing what happened.
But there's a part of her inside. This is why I'm I can't fully ascribe to your Gemma is dead theory, because there is a part of her that is alive even inside of Miss Casey that's and especially when we flash to the season 1 scene where she had been monitoring the MDR team and she was like, I really liked being here today.
Yeah.
Dejan Lockman on the official podcast that dropped this morning was talking about how when we see Miss Casey or when we see Gemma in all of these rooms, it's just her and fucking Dr. Maurer and Nurse Cecily. And that's all of her interactions. So there's something inside of Miss Casey, even though she doesn't actually know it, that is so happy to be around other people. There's just something inside of her that is still alive and kicking and is Gemma, despite all of the tinkering that they're doing with her brain,
I completely agree with that. Yeah, I don't want to overstate the death thing so much as I think that that's the experience Gemma was going through in the outside world as her her relationship was falling apart, as she was dealing with her the infertility.
Yeah.
And then she gets to this hellscape and these torture rooms. And our experience with this episode, we get answers to some of the biggest questions that Severance has been posing, including, what is Gemma alive, period?
Yeah.
I guess that's a question mark. Where is she? What has her existence been like? What was Mark and Gemma's life like before we met them, or at least met Mark over the course of the show? It's answering all those questions while raising the emotional stakes in such a huge way. And it's doing it in this really electric fashion that makes you reconsider basically everything we've seen in the show.
Yeah.
I've been going back and just thinking about so many different scenes and so many different characters and so many different interactions, knowing what we know now. And it feels like, even though the show is exciting, even though we were thrilled to cover it every week, it has new life now after watching this episode.
I told you I was daunted to do this podcast episode with you because I was like, it's too big.
There's
how do we
so
talk
much
about everything? Let's talk about this. You mentioned that this is one of the best episodes of television we've ever covered, if not the best. Part of that is sort of just filmmaking technique.
Yes.
So let's talk about what Jessica Lee Gagne does here.
Which standing fucking ovation, genuinely. Incredible, incredible work, especially for, granted, a long time director of photography, cinematographer, but first time directing credit on this show.
Yes. One thing that they mentioned on the official pod, basically she, at a certain point, conscripted Ben Stiller to be her second unit DP, and she gave him a Bolex camera, which, if people don't know what a Bolex camera is, it's 16 millimeter, one of those things you have to crank, sort of handheld camera. It's been used recently in films like Sean Baker's The Florida Project, Ann Biller's The Love Witch, a gorgeous film, Paul Schrader's First Reform, David Lowery's A Ghost Story. So basically directors who really just want to flex
Hell
and show
yeah.
you something cool and weird, they'll go for the Bolex camera. So that's something that she decided to use for these, to give us these sort of like warm, golden flashbacks. From a production design standpoint, I think the warmth and the sort of like lively clutter of Gemma and Mark's house, not to mention their offices, like pile with books and books and books and plants and plants and plants, compared to the soulless corporate housing that we have watched Mark exist in for the last season and a half, is devastating. Like it's a brilliant point of contrast, you know?
This is where the two inner Robs are at battle, because there is the inner Rob that loves monochromatic design.
Oh no.
And I'm looking at that bookshelf. I'm like, there's something aesthetically pleasing about the order of this, but also soul crushing about the lack of life in it.
Yeah.
And I think you're really onto something with that. Again, especially for someone who, like, their home is so bookish. It is so, like, riddled with plant life and sunlight, and like the steepling is off the charts. Like there's just so much happening in those flashbacks from a filmmaking perspective and a set deck perspective. I am preconditioned to love a kaleidoscopic, bittersweet view of a relationship rise and fall. Like that's just gonna hit me. That's gonna work for me basically every time.
You're a Blue Valentine kind of guy.
I don't know that anyone wants to identify as being a Blue Valentine kind of guy.
Yeah.
But perhaps I am.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's just executed at such a high level here.
Yeah.
To the point of transcending whatever you think about these sorts of montages. Joe, we have official dead dog wife territory here, which is something that usually you and I roll our eyes at, but here it is executed to such a beautiful and wonderful effect. I simply cannot.
It wasn't until the episode that it was over that I was like, wait, usually as soon as the dead dog wife montage starts, I'm like, here we go.
Well,
but there was just something like so special about the meet cute, the interaction in the office, the ant farm. Do you think the ant farm was a West Wing reference? Do you remember that in West Wing?
Where's the ant farm in West Wing?
There is no ant farm, but in West Wing, Timothy Busfield's character brings Alice and Janet. Yeah, goldfish.
I would love to think that that's the case.
He brings her a goldfish in a bowl, and she's like, "I like goldfish crackers." And
just a classic misunderstanding.
A great moment in TV dating.
Well, on the litigation of whether this is an official dead dog wife montage or not, can it be if Gemma's not dead?
Great question. I want to zero in on the plant imagery.
Please.
We've noted that it is like the land of always winter in and around Kier from what we've watched for a season and a half of this show. Watching, and we've got a Persephone name drop earlier in the season between Devin and Mark, and we talked about that at the time. But watching Gemma, like poison ivy plant goddess, surrounded by her house plants or out in the garden with the various flowers that are blooming. Like it is springtime.
Yeah.
The story of the myth of Persephone is Persephone was stolen away by Hades, dragged down into the underworld, and her mom, Demeter, goddess of the harvest, had to negotiate basically shared custody with this asshole who stole her daughter. When Persephone is above ground, it is summer and springtime. And when she is below ground, it is winter and fall. So the fact that it has been land of always winter because Gemma / Miss Casey is below ground, but in our hazy flashbacks, it was springtime. There were plants everywhere. Everything was in bloom when she was around. So
I gotta say, Joe, at this point, my Persephones and my Eurydices are getting crossed. Like there's so much hell imagery going on and so many different roles that Gemma is playing within this show to various characters and these kind of like mythological archetypal constructs. My head is spinning.
On that note, we did get a note from our listener Mikhail mentioning that. So Dr. Maurer, again, I do promise we'll talk about Robby Benson, the great Robby Benson,
we absolutely
who I was just like
must.
Thrilled to see, and I think is phenomenal in this episode. Mauer means wall in German, is what she pointed out, and in the musical Hadestown, which is the story of Orpheus and Eurydice and Persephone and Hades all intermingled together. Hades is depicted as this like evil lord of industry. The underworld is this sort of like smokestack filled, gears turning hellscape of constant working. And he has this whole song about why we build the wall. And basically he is like duped all of the residents of the underworld into believing that they have to build this wall to keep people out, and build the wall because work is what gives us meaning. And if that isn't Lumen, I don't know what is, you know?
Wait, are you telling me capitalism is like a hellscape or a prison?
Bad? Question mark?
I don't know, Joe. That seems far-fetched.
On the Meet Cute front, what do you make? Our listener Molly wrote in saying that she thought it was really odd. I loved the way it was done.
Yeah.
But the fact that when Mark meets Gemma at the blood drive, he says, "Who are you?"
Right.
And he says it in this like really sweet sort of like incredulity of like, you are so hot and so smart.
Where did you come from?
Cool. Who are you? Right?
Yes.
So that's all in there. But she made this really interesting connection between that Meet Cute and Mark S meeting Helly R on the table, and how that intake is very much like, who are you? Right? Ooh. Who are you is like an odd way. It's not like, what's your name?
Yeah.
Nice to meet you. I'm Mark. Anything like that. Who are you is not usually how one interacts, but I liked that idea as like a connection between the two. If you want to call the Helly sprawled on a table losing her mind a Meet Cute,
in its way.
Try. Yeah, in a way.
Not a lot of Helly in this episode, obviously.
Right.
One thing
Irving
I want
or Dylan.
Yeah, one thing I want to flag on Pregnancy Watch. Not our favorite subject. I don't know how Helly or Helena would be pregnant 3 days after having sex with both Marks. I don't know how any of this works. I don't know if that's where we're going to go. I was struck a little bit by Gemma's miscarriage, and she's in the shower, sat on the floor, holding her legs in almost exactly the same position and fashion we saw Helly last week in the hall when she's removed her shoes and is kind of going through a crisis. And look, Severance loves a mirror. Severance loves recursion. Severance loves playing Gemma and Helly opposite each other, visually speaking. I don't know what to make of any of that, but I think we got to throw it out there.
I didn't even consider that. My mind went immediately to Vesper Lind in a Bond movie.
No Daniel Craig around to suck her fingers, but you know.
But wow, upsetting. Thank you for raising that.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. But on that front, like talking about Ellie, something that like actually a couple of our listeners pointed out that I thought was interesting was this idea that if sort of building on something that Damon was talking about in our conversation about this idea of like, if you're attracted as innies, you're going to be attracted as outies. We get this with like our guys Irving. We get this with Helena and Mark and Helly and Mark, that there are sparks of flying no matter what the combination is, because there is something in you that is attracted to something in them. Does it mean anything? And again, we got a couple emails about this. Does it mean anything that Mark had no real spark with Miss Casey?
Maybe. I think it certainly could speak to the state of their relationship by the end, where I want to say this, like we get this incredible, not just montage sequence, but the scenes spliced throughout the entire episode of them stage by stage, from these two professors falling in love at the blood drive to their amazing, adorable house and this life that they're building together, to this like two prospective parents who are struggling with the process of that and trying to figure out how to be there for each other. And then as people who are just deeply, deeply in pain and drifting apart so clearly, like right out from under each other's grasp. And I think one of the things that I love about this episode is we get a very new understanding of Mark and who he was at the time when he was with Gemma.
And something we should say is there was a line or two about this in season 1, I think when he was dating that other woman and like often drunk. Oh, you have it. Okay.
I actually want to talk about that other woman. I have some revised thoughts, but let's get to that as we talk about the music later in this episode.
Okay, great point. Oh, creepy. Gotcha. Okay. I know what you're going for. Anyway, I believe there were lines in season 1 both about having trouble conceiving.
Yes.
And Mark implying that he was not always the best husband to Gemma. That was all seeded in season 1. Can we talk about Robby Benson?
we simply must. one of the most immediately contemptible characters in terms of just speed from introduction to hatred that I can remember seeing on TV.
Robby Benson is best known to me as the voice of the Beast from
Same.
Beauty and the Beast.
Yeah.
But I remember when he was sort of announced, or when they, I don't know, I was watching like The Wonderful World of Disney or something as a kid, and it's like Robby Benson's the voice of the Beast. I remember my mom being like, "Oh my God, it's Robby Benson," because he was like a heartthrob in the 70s.
Oh, yeah.
So 70s heartthrob, voice of the Beast from Beauty and the Beast, to creep dentist doctor with a wig fetish.
Is he a dentist?
Creep doctor with a dentist side habit.
I'm gonna claim victory on those not being dental tools because they are torture devices. He is not a dentist. He's not a dentist. He's just a guy jabbing her teeth.
He is using dental tools as a torture device. And
I don't know.
What did I say when we talked about it the first time? I mentioned Marathon Man and dentists as torturers.
You're right. It was right there the whole time.
There's a torture dentist and Alias. Like this is a well-worn trope. A friend of mine was texting me very excitedly last night while I was like trying to put together notes for 5 different podcasts. So I do apologize to him. But he was like really delighted by the meta casting of the voice of the Beast playing this guy who's like keeping this woman, a bookish woman, captured in his lair, and who sort of believes that they have a romantic connection beyond his purview as her doctor.
It's certainly really creepy, and like when he sort of parrots back the "I love you" catch as she's trying to leave the Christmas card room, just.
Was their house bugged then? Surely yes.
It seems like it might be, or they are able to in some way view or listen to or reconstruct some of Mark's memories based on his MDR work. I don't know exactly what's happening there. What is clear is he seems to be relishing playing house with her and the power that he wields over her.
It's so disgusting.
In a really like, honestly, my whole body just recoils watching his scenes, which is an incredible performance, and I think is sold in part by the demeanor, is in part sold by like Robby Benson's just like piercing eyes and his presentation in this episode. It's just a perfect affect for a creepy doctor you want to hate, and the absolute rage that swelled up inside me when he is telling her the lie about Mark moving on in the outside world.
And has a daughter.
I would like to think that I have seen enough TV and movies to not be so moved by something like that, but I felt so angry.
You were like, break his fingers again, Gemma.
Legit,
do it.
Straight up.
On the like, it was their house bugged front. The I love you too, stolen from their last goodbye in that nightmare Christmas room scenario.
Yes,
which is one thing.
We should say, I don't think we've noted yet, that was the Allentown room, which was the file that Mark completed in record time prior to season 1.
Great shout. Here's the other question on the bugging front. This is where we're gonna do music corner. We've got three entries to music corner this week.
A surprising amount of music commentary happening.
Alexa wrote in to say, I've noticed that we've heard the song I'll Be Seeing You by Billie Holiday 3 times now throughout the series. The first is when Mark is on the date with a doula.
Yep.
Second is when Mark reassembles the pieces of the torn picture of Gemma. Now we hear it again in a much more prominent way in episode 7, playing in both the flashback scenes of Mark and Gemma being cute and in love and their current horrific state of being trapped in Lumen, where the doctor abruptly cuts off the stereo. What do you want to say about that? You mentioned that you wanted to talk about the doula date. Like, do you feel like she's a Lumen plant? Like, what do you think?
I think the breadcrumbs are there in a different way than I noticed before. At the time, that character is presented so empathetically and as one of the few people who seems like an actual human living in Kier. You want to believe that Mark is just so damaged he can't have a functional relationship with a normal person. But revisiting it, and especially through this lens, right? You have, that is diegetic music that's being pumped into the restaurant for their date, as this woman is being very understanding, asking Mark to talk about his dead ex-wife on basically their first date.
Yeah.
And she's connected to the birthing retreat, and maybe even connected to how Miss Cobell gets hooked up with Devin in the first place for the lactation consultancy, the fraudulent lactation consultancy.
Thank you.
An epidemic in this country. Huge problem.
Yeah.
It certainly feels like it. And I would say even more so in conjunction with another email we got, Joe, from Adeline, who pointed out that the music that's playing in the Chinese restaurant when Helen and Mark meet in the outside world is the same music that's being played during the Egg Bar social in season 1 within the severed floor. And so, like, well observed all around.
Such a sharp observation.
There's these big pointing arrows to the idea that Lumen is running so much more of the outside world than we even may have understood based on the long grasp of a company this big.
Yeah.
And like now it really feels like that date and that whole conversation and everything that most of the people that he's been involved with outside are in some way prompting him to remember Gemma, think about Gemma. Like they are trying to keep the memory of her alive subconsciously in his head, whether he wants to move on or not.
Well, and how much of that is Lumen at large? And how much of that could be Harmony herself? Because Harmony sort of off assignment was pushing this with Mark, like stealing that scented candle and putting it in the room with Miss Casey. You know,
a girl can't have a hobby?
I mean, you would think that baking disgusting chamomile cookies would be enough to occupy you, but there you go.
I advocate for other hobbies other than that, even if it involves a little light B&E.
Okay. The third and final music. Okay, so a peek behind the curtain. These episodes drop on Thursday nights. We do have screeners so we can watch them in advance, but we like to record Friday mornings so that we can get emails from you guys and read the Reddit theories and all that sort of stuff like that. Listen to the official podcast. But it's like kind of a tight turnaround in terms of like early morning Friday prep. So I was up quite early this morning reading emails. And so it was just not the time of day for my experience that I had with this one email we got, but it's not our emailer's fault. So Yael wrote in about the music that's playing during the sort of idyllic flashback montage.
Yes.
It's a French song, Carousel. And he says it's a Jacques Brel song and it is used in this musical. There's a movie musical and a stage musical called Jacques Brel is Alive and Well and Living in Paris. So in the 1975 film adaptation of it, the song Carousel in Severance, it's in French. In the film, it's in English, and a woman is singing it. And Yael wrote, it's honestly kind of gives me strong Waffle Party vibes. It's dark, it's surreal. The characters discover that there are really terrifying marionette versions of themselves. There's a dead puppet master, Kier, and so much more. So I watched this video early this morning, and it gave me like full body tremors. It is so upsetting. And I think it's so interesting to, both inside the context of this episode and in that video that I watched, and it's on YouTube, you can watch it. Carousel, Ellie Stone, Jacques Brel is Alive and Well in Paris. The song just gets faster and faster. And so, Yael was pointing out like part of it is like the in and out of the various rooms that Gemma is doing. Part of it is sort of like this whirling exhilaration of, early romance between a couple. But there is a deeply sinister quality to this song, and which makes it a really interesting choice. I would say, like,
also just from a word cloud perspective, Carousel is jumping out at me because it also appears in this Billie Holiday version of "I'll Be Missing You." Like there's a lyric specifically about "I'll be seeing you."
Yeah.
About like it's like listing out all of these places in which you would see someone that you're missing, right? In the cafe, in the park across the way, the children's carousel. And with that song too, I think it plays just so beautifully as, Mark going through his version of grief and how he would see Gemma or how he would experience the loss of Gemma in his life. And also Gemma, whether she knows it or not, and I suspect not, reliving these horrible torture scenarios, but also in Allentown specifically, something that is so specific to her, right? This idea that she hates writing these thank you notes. And so she is living a hell in his memory based on what he knows that she hates to do. And how twisted that idea is for, a big company like Lumen to wield that against somebody.
Somehow the creepiest part of Dr. Mauer's whole thing, actually, I don't know. I'm not sure I'm ready to call it this. It's like
it's a long list.
It's the wigs and the costumes. Like it's so gross. The plane crash one was actually like kind of the weirdest one for me. Like even though like the Christmas one is and the dentist one are also like very sinister. It was the way he was like having so much fun with this like plane crash scenario that just like really fucking
and
creeped me
doesn't
out.
have to do it. She's not going to remember anything about the way you look. And in fact, I would argue for scientific purposes might be more constructive if you didn't look different. Control one of the variables here.
Our listener Dan asked, do you think there's a reason why we cut away before we see Gemma's last name?
I don't think so. I think it is canonically understood that her name is Gemma Scout.
But yeah, they're at the clinic, so she would probably be Scout at that point. Like, but we don't know what her last name was before they got married.
No, I don't. But I think if it was something of macro note, like if she was Gemma Egan,
I don't think
he would have already had a lot of reactions to her being an Egan because he knows Helena Egan.
He sure does know Helena Egan. What did you think of the sequence we got with Devin and Rickon and the foursome of them together?
I thought that this was one of my favorite parts about the overall flashback construction is how different all four of them are and how different Devin, like Mark is laughing at Rickon's jokes. Like that's how far we have come from the people that they used to be. I adored that sequence.
The genial nature of Mark saying, yeah, Rickon, what's wrong with you? Like, it's just like the bitterness isn't there, that impatience isn't there. And this, I had mentioned that I had listened to the official podcast and the actor who played Rickon was on, and he was like, we don't know what Devin and Rickon's relationship was like before, basically he said that knowing that this scene was coming where we would see what the foursome were like together. We have heard Devin say, we were all very close together, that this is grief for her too. The near silent communication of the news that Gemma is pregnant. So that connection between Devin and Gemma, like it was just really...
I think just striking that we never hear the word pregnant in this episode. We never hear the word miscarriage. We never hear the words fertility clinic. And yet it's all very clear what is happening because the filmmaking is that strong. Like you absolutely do not need to do that. And it's a testament to what Severance holds back in its execution. Obviously, from a question and answer standpoint, it holds back quite a lot. But there are all of these little openings where because you're not explicating, you let emotion and you let character fill that moment.
Do you have time in your life and space in your heart for a little bit more mythology?
Always, Joe. What are we doing here if not that?
Always? Okay. Damon mentioned this concept. It's also a Greek concept. The River of Lethe being this like river of forgetting in the underworld. I didn't know this. So fun to learn. I knew about the River Styx. I kind of knew about the River Acheron. I knew about the River Lethe. There's like 5 infernal rivers. And I just want to say that the phrase infernal river is delightful. But the River of Forgetting in Plato's Republic, it's like the souls of the departed were made to drink the Lethe before their reincarnation, that they are meant to forget their previous life before they move on to this other life. So is Cold Harbor, is the final step like a full wipe of who Gemma ever was? We know the clean slate protocol exists inside of Lumen's network. To go back to that Eurydice play that I was encouraged to read by our listeners, that has a whole plot about drinking from the River of Forgetting and like what it means to die and forget or die and be forgotten and all of that sort of stuff. So this idea of like Gemma, to go back to this idea of them like slowly somewhat scrambling her brain is part of this sort of like River of Forgetting underworlds, losing touch of who she actually is or ever was, which is devastating.
I think that's definitely there. I also think there's the read where the severed floor itself is the River of Forgetting, where she is going into the space where as soon as she gets there, she forgets who she is and becomes Miss Casey.
Yeah.
And the only way she's going to find her way out is presumably with someone like Mark's help. We're told in this episode, Drummond kind of chides Maurer about the idea that when she does go into Cold Harbor, you're going to have to say goodbye to Gemma, right? So we know something dramatic is going to happen in there. I'm guessing, again, it's not the puppy room. But I do
and Maurer's like, yeah, no problem. I know.
Yeah, he's totally cool with it. I'm sure it's not going to be an issue.
Yeah.
But yeah, to get out of here, she is probably gonna have to pass through the severed floor as Miss Casey in some fashion. It doesn't seem like there's any other way out.
Yeah.
And so in doing so, that feels very Eurydice to me. That feels very this idea of like, you have to be let out of this place. And until the moment where you cross this threshold, you're like a shade version of your actual self until you can finally get clearance on the topside world.
Rob, that's so good. I love it. On the one hand, I love every single syllable you just uttered. On the other hand, I really loved that it was like Gemma nearly saving herself.
Yes.
There's so many people who like ended this episode. We got emails or on the internet who were like, oh my God, Mark has to save her. And it's like, yeah, I mean, obviously,
it's gotta help.
She has to be saved. But I was like, but I like it even better if she can save herself. I think that is even cooler.
I thought this episode was kind of Gemma's version of the season 1 Racing the Clock finale, where all the members of the MDR team have these like critical missions about their own like individual selves and are trying to solve them as fast as possible. And she gets this like absolute race to the elevator in a way that I think also mirrors, this season opens with Mark racing around these white, bright hallways looking for Miss Casey. And it ends with Gemma racing around these dark, terrifying hallways trying to get to the elevator to get out.
I think and also, I mean, we should say the construction of the testing floor, which on the official podcast, they talked about at length that they wanted it to be of a piece with Lumen. So it's still like all white and bright, but like very distinct in terms of like, we're not doing straight hallways. We've got these weird triangular jutting shapes. And then the lighting, and this was, this was the directors of this episode's idea, to do the floor lighting. She was like, the first thing I envisioned in this floor, knowing that Gemma was going to do this run through it, was lighting up the floor from underneath so that as she goes, she's lighting up. We've seen the overhead lighting, but this is like underneath lighting, and it was visually quite stunning. And here's a quote from the inside the episode that airs after the episode that I think is important to underline. And this comes from Dan Erickson. He says, what's going on the severed floor somehow contributes to what's going on down below, but we still don't know why.
Yeah.
So I know that the Redditors are going to be poring over every single like freeze frame, but we should point out that we've got the 4 people who aren't quite the doppelgangers, but still doubles of our MDR team. They're credited they're billed in the credits as like Mark Watcher, Irving Watcher. So like their job is to watch our team as our team refines something,
I see them as refiners, They're here just overseeing it all. Just really trying to get these guys to be their best possible selves.
They're paying attention to things on a granular level, and we love that for them.
One takeaway from that, like in addition to the doppelgangery element, which is just goofy and creepy and wonderful, I feel like we learned that maybe the severed floor itself is not as surveilled as we might have thought, because as they are trying to figure out why Mark's progress on Cold Harbor has stalled, Drummond's explanation is, that nosebleed really put us back, and not, the fact that Mark and Hallie are refining each other's data really put us back this week. Like they don't know everything that's going on, but they do know that Mark went to Miss Huang for a nosebleed.
Beautifully put. I believe them that there aren't video cameras on the floor anymore.
It seems that way.
Because they thought they had a spy. But that's all gone to shit. Back to book corner, back to academic corner. We actually got a couple emails from listeners about the literary works of George Saunders. Now, I know that you don't like a piece of fiction.
Only Russian novellas, I'm sorry.
Well, on that note, so George Saunders wrote a book called Lincoln in the Bardo, which is about Lincoln mourning at his son's crypt and Lincoln sort of slipping into a Bardo space. So that's, something that was on their mind. And Ben Stiller owns the rights to one of George Saunders' earlier stories, Civil War Land in Bad Decline, which is about a fucked up workplace, even more fodder for the Civil War theories, Becky writes. But the one that a lot of people have been writing in about is this story called Escape from Spiderhead, which was turned into a really bad Chris Hemsworth film, Spiderhead. But this is Becky's description of Spiderhead. Quote, shadowy pharma corp with, quote, employees test subjects inside who did not really have the full knowledge, knowing consent of what they were signing up for. Experiments involving love and sadness and human relationships performed on these employees who grow reluctant to participate as they become more aware of what's going on. Even some elements of innie versus outie and the dangled reward of limited communication with the outside world. And spoiler alert, a subject embracing suicide rather than continuing with the experiments. So what Becky wrote is, I like to think of Severance as what we might have gotten if George Saunders had been asked to write a TV show. And the one thing I will add to that, I think George Saunders is a great, if you're like, hey, I want to read more stuff that's like reminds me of Severance, I think George Saunders is a great pick. And a book that I read that actually I read because Damon Lindelof recommended reading it like several years ago is a book called A Swim in a Pond in the Rain, in which 4 Russians give masterclass on writing, reading, and life. And this is based on George Saunders, a class he teaches at Syracuse University about Tolstoy, Chekhov, Gogol, and Turgenev. So it's about analyzing their work and how it gets to the root of how we tell stories. It's a really, really good book. But basically everything I know about Tolstoy, I learned from that book. So I just think it's really funny that Saunders came back around this week in a couple different ways. And all of that is... I just am really grateful for our emails from our listeners. I think
they've been so good for Severance in particular.
It's just really great stuff.
And what a Ringerverse recommends from you, Joe. Just smuggling a whole ass segment into this podcast.
That the book about the Russian masters was really fucking incredible. I read it with I have notes in the margin, which I haven't done since like college. Okay. Last but not least is a theory.
Okay.
And I would love your thoughts on it. Danielle writes, what do you think about the possibility of Irving being a prior test subject like Gemma currently is, and somehow it involved Bert? Severance has been around for 12 years at least, and Gemma has only been there for 2 years. Thoughts?
Seems entirely possible. And we have yet to see so many of the functions of the Severance chip, including the blank slate, which just kind of looms over all of this.
Yeah.
It feels like Irving could be the kind of guy whose innie has been blank slated several times. Even maybe with his knowledge. It may have even been the kind of thing where they informed him of what was happening. And that maybe contributed to him wanting to investigate the company. But he's been around for so long.
If we get to experience a montage of John Turturro in several different wigs and several different accents and several different costumes.
Could we even be so lucky?
Yeah, I mean. All right. We loved this episode. Anything else you want to say about it before we go to the Damon conversation?
I've I guess big picture, small picture.
Yeah.
Let's start small on the most granular possible level.
Okay.
During some of these very flashy, very athletic, as our friend Amanda Dobbins would say, bits of filmmaking in this episode.
Yeah.
Camera moving down the dark hallways, kind of like almost stop motion-y effect. I'm wondering if this is coming from that kind of hand cranked camera situation. We get a lot of random like one frame insert shots of bits and pieces of Mark and Gemma lore. I did my best to scrub and to see what these shots are. This is what I've got.
Mahoney. All right.
We see a split second of Mark's hands from season 1 as he's sculpting the tree that Gemma crashed into very quickly. One of our earliest reminders in the show of the kind of like fragments of memory that might be seeping through for someone like Mark. We see Mark standing outside near some woods at night, which she does in season 1 when he revisits the place where he thinks Gemma has died. And also kind of the bend in the road. We see a flash of that as well. You see a man, you can't see his face, just reaching out and putting, it looks like his hand on someone else's chest or someone else's shoulder. Not unlike the other Lumen ideographic cards that we've seen. Like it's not quite one-to-one, but maybe reminiscent.
Interesting.
You get just kind of like a general icy road. You get the headlights through the woods at night. You get the snowy road from a first-person perspective, as if someone were driving down it. You get a sort of soft table lamp, a red flower, which, look, if that's not Belle and Beast coded, I don't know what is. And just some associated shots of Gemma along the way. A lot of it seems like things we've already seen and things they've already shot. But I'm curious if any of those will take on newfound significance as we go.
I love that. Thank you so much for doing that work. That is, it's very like Crash. Not the terrible Best Picture winner, but, let's invoke what happened here without showing you specifically like this is how Lumen planted a body or anything like that. What's your big picture?
I think I just want to underscore again that this episode turned me into a complete mess. Was really emotional in a way that I wasn't expecting. And that honestly, I was kind of wondering if Severance would be capable of. This is a process in a show I find very like intellectually stimulating, right?
Yes.
You and I banding about these theories. I love the sci-fi concepts. I love the execution and the filmmaking. I wouldn't say this is a show I felt like a really strong emotional pull to. And in one episode, all of a sudden, like my whole emotional relationship to this show has been turned upside down. And overall seeing the arc and the painful incremental way that Mark and Gemma came together and came apart, it just really had an effect on me. And I can't salute this episode enough.
It doesn't personally bother me when Chris and Andy don't like a show that I like. Like, I think that's fine. We're all like allowed to like different things. I don't need them to like Severance in order for me to like Severance, but I am curious if this episode moves the needle for them in any direction in terms of how they've been receiving this season. Because I think that has been part of their critique is like, this feels like clever without being emotional in the way that they might want it to be. And I feel like I've felt, like the Irving stuff in episode 4, like I feel like I've had emotional moments. This is a leveling up for sure. I completely agree. Thank you to Justin Sayles for his tireless work on this very vibrant and busy feed. Similarly to John Richter, who has been working his tail off on the video side of everything. And to our guy, Grady.
Always.
Who is just the best and did incredible work turning that Damon interview around and all sorts of stuff. So we will see you for White Lotus next week and for Severance again and again and again. And here we are on the carousel of content. See you soon. Bye.